There's a few familiar faces. Welcome, Dr. David, from your journeys. A lot of people are showing up. This is great.
It's nice to be back, I think, from all of our, I seem to be an employee of Kevin Conley.
Nice.
Supposed to be retired.
Hi, Jana. I know you're doing a lot of work for being retired, aren't you?
You know what? You don't pay him a whole lot either.
Yeah, that's true. It'll be delayed for a bit as well. So Andrew is coming to us from London. And if he has any technical difficulties, then we'll discuss other aspects of Greece, and then we'll come back around to Andrew when he signs back in again. But it looks like it's pretty stable now. That's good. And I can't see everybody, so if I failed to say hi to you, I apologize. It's because I can't see you.
So Marilyn is in Istanbul, apparently, right? Nice.
I am, and I hope you notice that Istanbul is orange and blue tonight.
Good move.
Where is she?
Right there.
There you are.
She's not in
Hi.
Istanbul, she's over here.
She's probably a number of blocks from you. Hey, Gretchen. Haven't seen you in a while.
Hey.
There's Becky. Hey, Becky. Becky's on mute. Becky just traveled with us through Portugal and Spain.
That's right.
Hi, Becky.
Oh my gosh.
All right, so I'll just explain to everybody. Hi, and welcome to our happy hour. I'm Kevin Conley, the director of Alumni and Parent Travel at the University of Virginia, also known as Cavalier Travels. And we are blessed to have Andrew O'Shaughnessy, who is coming to us from London today, and he's going to be faculty on one of our Greece trips this fall. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the, I'll let him tell you what he's going to talk to you about. He's also vice president of Monticello, and he's happy to answer questions about that too, right, Andrew?
I am indeed, Kevin. And
Yes.
I am a little concerned. The screen keeps saying your connection is unstable. So please forgive me if I cut out at any point, but I'm thrilled to be the speaker director on board the Callisto, and we may have an opportunity to have a representative of the company talk about the boat in a little while. This is the tour, and I want to talk really today about the idea behind the trip, the choice of destinations, which I think is particularly well chosen, because we're not just seeing mainland Greece, but also places associated with the Athenian Empire, including the west coast of Turkey, or the Aegean coast of Turkey, which has some of the best of the Greek monuments. This is where the earliest school of philosophy in Miletus emerged, a very important part of the Greek world. My most recent trip in that part of the world was on board a small yacht with just 6 people and also crew as well. It was really like something from Below Deck, this terrible reality series. So I'm going to be very curious about the Callisto. I'm not just going to be speaking in my lectures, as the brochure might imply, about how the founders were inspired by this part of the world. I want to talk about the history of this region as well. I want to consider why it was so influential, why it's regarded really as the birthplace of democracy, why it was so important in terms of its cultural efflorescence, and to also explain why democracy essentially began here, We're appropriately spending the first couple of days in Athens, which is regarded as having had the purest form of democracy, really almost in any period, although I'm going to query that term in a moment. It was one of the three largest polises. Polis was a fortified town, and this made up much of Greater Greece. In the third quarter of the 4th century BC, there were over 1,100 polises, many of them loosely federated. Almost half of them were semi-democratic, but Greece was really regarded as the pioneer and the leader. The other large polis was, of course, Sparta, Greece's rival in the southwest Peloponnese, and Syracuse in Sicily. I said I will query the word democracy because my academic colleagues would probably be unhappy my using it, either for Athens or for revolutionary America. The fact is, of course, it was a democracy that excluded women. It was a democracy largely to male landowners, and it was a democracy that contained slavery. We don't have exact proportions on Athenian slavery. It varied, of course, between period, but like Virginia, it was anywhere between about 30 and 40% of the population. But the important feature of Greek democracy in Athens is it was direct, that every male participated or could potentially participate and gather together at the main assembly. The word democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning the people. And this would be the inspiration for later periods. The first day that we're in Athens, we'll be visiting the battle site of Marathon. This was a battle fought against the attempted invasion by the Persian Empire in 490 BC. The Greeks generally regarded this much like the West during the Second World War. This was an attempt at invasion by what they regarded as the tyrannical East, Darius I of Persia, and they regarded themselves as representing liberty against tyranny. So it's a very important site for the Athenians and indeed for modern Greeks. The first really great historian, Herodotus, presented this as a war between freedom and between tyranny. And in fact, it was by no means the end of the war. There was a sea battle later called Salamis, in which the Greeks actually had to abandon Athens and allow the Persians to invade it while they focused on defeating Persia in a naval battle. So a lot of what you see, the Acropolis, which I showed at the beginning, a lot of what you see actually began with this man, Pericles, who was the leader of Athens, but an elected leader off and on between 462 and 451 BC. And this was the period in which really democracy, as in its limited form, began to flourish. It was also a great period for the flourishing of Greek culture generally, which we'll speak about in a moment. The Americans were never interested in Greek democracy at the time of the revolution. They weren't looking to create a democracy, ironically, but what they did get from the Greeks, and Athens in particular, was the idea of mixed government, the idea of constitutions. Sparta and Athens both had constitutions. In the case of Athens, it was credited to someone called Solon. They'd had federal systems like American federalism. They'd had elections. They'd had rotation of offices. They believed in natural law and natural rights. They even began paying people to be in office. So many of these ideas, and indeed the very study of politics, began in Athens. Perhaps one of the greatest, earliest works on politics, or began in the Greek world, was Aristotle's famous book, Politics. I mentioned that Athens and the Athenian Empire also became the great center for a cultural renaissance. We see the birth of philosophy, figures like Plato and Socrates, the beginnings of real history writing, the beginnings of literature and theater. As one commentator said, every form of literature really began with the Greeks, except for the novel, which of course started much later. The beginnings of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, it all started with the Greeks. And again, in this trip, we're going to want to ask why. And one of our first trips will be to the Acropolis. We'll be visiting the Pnyx, spelt P-Y-N-P-N-Y-X, which is where these great speeches were made and people would assemble. And we'll look at how Athens was to fight Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. The other great feature of this trip is that we'll be seeing the span of Greek history. The period of democracy is really the 5th and 4th centuries, but Greek history is much longer. And we will start with the first Greek world that was centered in Crete, known as the Minoan world, that was really only discovered in the 1890s by an Oxfordist archaeologist called Sir Arthur Evans. This was a world unknown to Pericles and his contemporaries. This world had been buried and forgotten. And Evans managed to reconstruct this incredible palace of Knossos, a ceremonial palace with some 15 storerooms that spread over 6 acres. He reconstructed some of the wonderful frescoes, especially ones that feature bulls. And this is bull vaulting, which apparently was done by both men and women, or bull leaping. It was a palace which had indoor plumbing with bathrooms. And this was known as the Minoan world that flourished. It was flourishing during the Bronze Age and right through to 1200 BC. And part of it would be destroyed by one of the most cataclysmic geological disasters in history. It apparently was the equivalent of 2 million Hiroshima bombs going off at once that would destroy part of the Minoan and its parallel and later rival and mainland-based Mycenaean Empire. This volcano erupted in Santorini, which we're also visiting, earlier known as Thera. The Economist says that this is one of the most picturesque places anywhere. and one of the favorites, the explosion was actually recorded as far away as China. It's possibly the original Atlantis that Plato wrote about. The eruption occurred around 1645 BC. Of course, dates in this period are very difficult to establish. And we'll also be visiting Delos, which became part of the Athenian Empire and was also part of one of the first federations. It was known as the Delian League, which was created by Athens and really became the nucleus of the Athenian Empire. This was where the League originally had its treasury. It was also the birthplace of Apollo. And this gives you an idea of the Athenian Empire in about 478 BC. It reminds us how large the Athenians, just how far they spread. Their empire included Sicily, parts of Italy, parts of Egypt, to the Black Sea, and Anatolia, which I was describing earlier. And of course, one of the themes that we want to trace is the impact of this world and the impact of these ideas on America's founders. I happen to be particularly interested in Jefferson, but I won't solely be discussing Jefferson. We'll look at the impact on the American Constitution, but also not just the political impact, the impact too culturally of the Aegean world, the Greeks on America. Remember, most Americans, educated Americans during the colonial period and right through to the Civil War would study the classics. They would study both Greek and Roman literature and also their history, their philosophical ideas, and their literature. It was regarded as a broad training in itself. 3 years after UVA was founded, and Jefferson wanted to make the classics voluntary at UVA, he didn't put them at the center of the syllabus, unlike nearly any other university in America. 3 years after he created the university, and the first class in 1825, Yale, in a report in 1828, said that the classics should be at the front and center of the education of any college. And that tradition would continue for a lot of the antebellum period. But Jefferson admired the Stoics, although not all part of Stoicism. He was interested in the Greek philosopher Epicurus. Before he returned to editing the Bible, he was particularly influenced by some of the Greek religious and philosophical ideas. He loved Homer, and in fact was very critical of translations of the Iliad. He preferred to read it in the original and was copying sections of it out, even in his youth. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey was also the diet of most Greeks for centuries. That was their literature before their own great writers. We'll also, and Jefferson, of course, corresponded broadly, and one of his correspondents in Greece was this man, Adamantios Koreas, and he was a great scholar. He's regarded as one of the founders of modern Greek literature, a forerunner of Greek independence. He lived on the island of Chios, which is also thought to be the birthplace of Homer. We'll be visiting that island, and we'll also be visiting the library, which contains some of his correspondence, including his correspondence with Jefferson. He's one of the really the leading Greek figures of the Enlightenment. His years he lived slightly longer, his years almost coterminous with Jefferson from 1848 to 1833. One of the things that fascinates me is the influence of the classics on the United States to this day. We see it especially in architecture. I'm looking here at the Capitol building in Washington, DC. The pediments, the columns, the porticos, and the symmetry, all of these were ideas from Greek architecture. The one thing the Greeks didn't develop was the dome, which was one of Jefferson's favorites. But what I'd stress is that in every part of the United States, this architecture has been repeated. I taught for many years in central Wisconsin, even the public library, and certainly the Capitol in Madison and the Capitol building are all use classical architecture. In the talks that I'll be giving, I'll talk about how knowledge of the Greeks, how it was disseminated, how it came through the Romans. So although the founders were often more interested in the Romans than the Greeks, they often took from the Romans Greek ideas. It was spread through the Byzantine and also Macedonian Empire. The Renaissance, beginning in about the 12th century, the Greeks were rediscovered by Europeans, and of course the Enlightenment, which was at its height during the time of the establishment of America. These were key times when Greek ideas were being discovered. There's still huge gaps in our knowledge of Greek civilizations, great works that have never been recovered, even Aristotle's Politics. What we have is really a draft rather than a final form. But the rediscovery of this pre-Christian civilization was to be an enormous stimulant to modern European history, beginning with the Renaissance. And my final set of lectures, and again, this is an appropriate slide because when we see that slide, inevitably at the moment, we think about January the 6th. And the final set of lectures will be on the limitations of democracy and the weaknesses and what the Greeks most feared, that you would get the rise of what they called tyrannos, tyrants, or monarchos, monarchies, populism, or what they would often call demagogues. The Greeks were very alive to this, and it was something that they and the Romans inculcated in the American founders. The American founders were almost paranoid about the potential threats that a populace could have and potentially overthrow the system of government, the Constitution. It's one of the reasons that they like to make the laws widely available. When we're in Crete, we'll go through the Capitol and we'll see some of the first written laws in stone so that ordinary members of the public could see what the law is. And in this lecture, I'll talk quite a lot about John Adams, who himself said of the Greeks and the Romans, it's not past history, it's the history of my time and future history. John Adams saw in the Greeks and Romans a mirror to our own times and one that we could learn from. And I'll particularly talk about Alex de Tocqueville, who's in many ways was a proponent of democracy, but also was very sensitive to some of its weaknesses and limitations, even though he thought that America would ultimately be a system of government adopted throughout much of the rest of the world. And what we describe as American, he really felt were features of a democratic people which would spread outside America as democracy spread. Thank you very much. Did that come through?
I think it came through very well. For those of you who entered late,
Good.
Andrew is actually in London and had some connectivity issues. So that's why it was kind of a little bit spotty there, but we thank him so much for staying up late and doing this for us, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. I think also on this call is Margaret Devlin, who is the president of the Thales of Journeys. Is it president or CEO or both?
I think I'm managing director or something, but I don't pay too much attention to titles.
Right. So she's going to tell us a little bit about the boat. And I guess this one we can call a boat because you can put it on a ship, right? Is that how it works?
Yes, we call it a small private style yacht. The Callisto is a ship that the founders of Thales of Journeys have worked with for many, many years in the past on alumni travel programs in many parts of the world. But the Aegean is the home of Callisto. She accommodates only 34 guests in 17 cabins. So she is a small, intimate trip. I see David Geis smiling because he'll be on the Callisto a little bit later in the fall on a different itinerary. But what I can say from having sailed on this ship itself and heard feedback from a number of travelers is there's something very special about being on a vessel, on a ship that is this small. I will tell you that it's a very stable ship. It's a heavy ship. New stabilizers were recently installed on the vessel, so it's not a catamaran. It takes the seas very well. But there's sort of a pride of ownership that takes place on about day 2, maybe beginning of day 3 of every cruise, because as you go through the Greek islands, you will come into ports where there are numerous huge cruise ships. And the Callisto looks like a little dwarf next to them, but suddenly people become very proud of the fact that they have their own private yacht, that it has this level of intimacy and congeniality that takes place aboard ship. And we also pursue an itinerary that is different from many other ships. Yes, we do go to Crete and we do go to the Palace at Knossos. We make every effort to visit the Palace of Knossos at a time of day when it's less crowded, which is more or less in the afternoon. And then the same holds true when we go to Santorini. I hate to tell you, but Santorini will be very, very crowded. But it's an island not to be missed. We oftentimes contemplate whether we should take Santorini out of our cruises because it has become so crowded. But it's magical to come into the harbor there. I mean, it's magical to come into the caldera, to take the funicular up to the top of the island. And then we have a motor coach waiting to take our travelers out to Akrotiri, which is a very important Bronze Age archaeological site that your typical cruise traveler is just there to shop and say they've been to Santorini, and we offer a different experience there, as well as visiting the archaeological museum in the town, which is wonderful. But then we set out to different islands that are less frequently visited. 2 of those are Delos, which was just discussed, but also Naxos, which is one of the larger of the Cycladic islands. It's a very verdant, green, heavily vegetated island, filled with beautiful small villages, and we go up into the countryside, into these villages, and get a completely different picture of Greece. It's very agricultural. This is where Greeks live and work and earn their livings and raise their families, and it's not impacted so heavily by tourism.
Margaret,
Yes.
it looks like David has something to add.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Please do, David. Yes.
No. At the end of this, I just have a question. Please continue, Margaret. This is very.
Okay, all right, okay. But
Okay.
anybody who wants to interrupt, just alert me, Kevin, because I'm not paying attention to that.
Okay.
Chios likewise is, you know, an island that is rarely visited by big cruise ships. So it's a wonderful experience because you get to really see more typical Greek life. And then in certain places, there will be heavy tourism. Continuing on up to Turkey, I mean, I must say that the opportunity to visit Troy is a very special one. One has to have an imagination to imagine what the site was like in a Bronze Age period. But both Andrew and our Greek guide, who will accompany you throughout the trip, which is another thing I'd like to, well, excuse me, when we're in Troy, we'll be with an excellent guide from Turkey. And the same is true when you reach Istanbul, if you happen to be participating on the optional extension in Istanbul. But during the Greece portion of the trip, we have one outstanding guide who will be with you throughout the entire voyage. And the advantage of that is that she can build upon sites that you've seen on the previous day or refer to what you might see the next day. So she'll provide much more continuity in the overall experience. And ashore, we have some wonderful meals and really enjoy Greek cuisine when we have our lunches ashore during the cruise. Some of those are ashore. So that just gives you a bit of a preview. I mean, if anyone has specific questions, I'd be happy to address them, starting with David. It's to be there in early September. The tourism has started to abate somewhat in early September. I mean, August is a very crowded month, and then things start to calm down a bit in September, but the weather is still wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Russians have gone home, and hopefully the airlines will be caught up on everything by then.
I actually have a technical question as one of the lecturers. What are the facilities for doing the lectures on the boat?
Okay, we have complete AV link up to your laptop and a screen where all the guests in the main lounge can assemble, order a drink, and enjoy the lecture. The ship also has a small library, and it has a very commodious deck where we sometimes will serve like a barbecue dinner outdoors. People can take their lunch outdoors. So there is really nice outdoor space. Some of it is protected from the sun, and on the upper deck, it's open to the sun.
Nice. For those of you who haven't met her yet, this is Lynne Musser, is who you have perhaps spoken with on the phone if you call into our office or get her to call you back. She's the assistant director at Cavalier Travels and also an alumna. And she'll be on our Ireland trip this fall, if anybody's interested.
And she's
Nice
also,
to meet you all.
she also traveled with me when I lectured for a week in Oxford with Jeannie Grant Moore. We did a program called The Old World and the New. And Mary Lynn was a great host and helped us a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
And I can vouch for the fact that Andrew is absolutely fascinating, but he's also a lot of fun. You might think that behind that accent, he might be a little stiff, but he is not. He is a lot of fun. And I had the unfortunate pleasure of not traveling with David Geis, but I know that he's a lot of fun too. And many of you have traveled with him. So 2 great Greece cruises.
One of the things that I did want to mention, we do have several cabins still available for the September 1st program. And we are opening a policy. We have no single travelers on the trip. And so we are making it possible for single travelers to travel now at no supplement. So I don't know if there are any singles here in this room or if you have friends who might be interested. But typically there's a rather significant supplement for single travel, and that's being waived on a limited number of cabins. So I just wanted to make you aware of that.
I might have to go on that trip myself, Margaret. That's a really good deal.
We'll let you come, but no single supplement, Kevin.
I know. I like that. I like that. Does anybody have questions for either Andrew or Margaret or me or
Well,
David or Mary Lynn?
I did notice there were a couple of points in the chat function. One is from Gretchen Tibbetts, who says how wonderful Delos is, but another important point from Patrick Campbell, who talks about the problem of defining democracy and the various forms of democracy. He would be amused that I have colleagues who will go purple in the face, even if I describe America as proto-democratic in the late 18th and early 19th century. But the fact is, of course, it created the framework from which our current democracy, as he says, there's really no pure form of democracy or absolute form of democracy. And what we don't have even now is direct democracy like Athens, where all the people are present. There's a very good book by Edmund Morgan about the problem of trying to define the people and find a system that reflects them. There are those who push proportional representation and talk about the limits of the party system. So, of course, it's very difficult, but this clearly represented a very important source of inspiration. Greek ideas and Greek culture became particularly popular in America in the 19th century. And I recommend a book by Caroline Winterer on the classics in America. And that's the time when Greek architecture particularly and Greek culture reached the high point of popularity in the antebellum period, and people were particularly conscious of the comparison. And I have sent out a bibliography to some people, and I'm happy to send it out to many more, and we'll send out more material as we get closer to the trip. And I think those who are signing up through UVA even may be getting a free book.
We're working on that.
Yes.
Actually, we're waiting for you to tell us what it's going to be, but
I actually like Mary Lynn's first suggestion, although I did mention to her that currently there's a, and it's clearly just a popular encyclopedia of ancient Greece that I happened to see the other day in Barnes and Noble. The author was not someone that I knew as being an authority, but it was beautifully illustrated. The articles that I've looked at are really quite good. And so I suggested that as a follow-up. Do you have the name of the editor there? We were corresponding earlier.
Yes, hold on, Nigel somebody, hold on.
Yes.
I do like the Cahill book that she recommended. That's
Yeah, I think that would be better because it's a narrative and people can just read that on the airline.
Yeah, and he's a very engaging writer.
The other is more of a reference book, but as a popular reference book, it might be a good one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And what is the Cahill book?
Sailing the Wine Red Sea.
Right.
It's good. He also did how the Irish saved civilization, which is a good.
I remember. Mm-hmm.
Good one.
Since I'm not in competition with my very good friend Andrew, and we've been friends for a very long time, and this trip is going to be so great. If I weren't doing it 2 months later, I would be coming with you, Andrew. But I'm going to assign a book by Daniel Mendelsohn called An Odyssey, which is absolutely thrilling. If you have not read it, it's his personal story of the Odyssey he took with his father, teaching the Odyssey at Princeton, and then going on Homer's Odyssey with his father. It is one of the most wonderful books I have read in a very long time. And he's a UVA undergraduate.
Really?
So if you've not read Daniel Mendelssohn's An Odyssey, Travels Father and Son, something like that, I recommend it. But that's the book I'm going to recommend, Mary Lynne, for my travelers later on.
I've already written it down, David.
It's absolutely.
I'm just going to add parenthetically. Well, first, I also think it's a superb book, and I only recently read it. But the Odyssey that Daniel Mendelssohn participated on with his father was a Travel Dynamics Journey of Odysseus trip in the Mediterranean those many years ago.
Wow.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, that's
even more reason to read this book. I mean, it just is. I thought it was thrilling and moving and informative and historical and literary and well written. I mean, it was very, very impressed with it.
Yeah. Travel Dynamics, for those of you who don't know, is the operator that Margaret used to work for, and that's who we did the last Callisto trip that we did, actually, with who were we selling that with? Columbia, I think, and we outsold them, I think, and filled up the whole boat almost, except for like 2 spots. But
Right. Travel Dynamics was the predecessor company to Thalassa Journeys. And so those of us who were principals at Travel Dynamics several years ago founded Thalassa, and we're delighted to be doing what we've enjoyed doing for so many years and to be working with UVA and others again.
great.
And the book to which Andrew was just referring is an illustrated encyclopedia of ancient Greece by Nigel Rogers. And Nigel Rogers actually has a few books out. One is the complete illustrated encyclopedia. So, so those of you on this cruise will be getting something similar.
Right.
Also,
Well, thank you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Was another message in the chat box from Laurie Felton, who said the trip sounds incredible. She talks about visiting Greece and Ephesus in 1985. She says she's not sure her budget's going to expand to this because she's just been in Iceland, so she's hoping you'll repeat it. I would like to tell you that my very first trip to the Aegean was in 6th and 7th grade, when there used to be something called the school ship, and it was HMS Nevessa, and it was a former troop carrier, and it took loads of school children, British school children, across the Aegean. It was the first and last time that I saw some of the sights. I remember it twice tried to visit Santorini, and the waves were too choppy, and it was a larger ship, so it wasn't able to go in land. But certainly some parts of Egypt. I was recently in Halicarnassus, what is modern Bodrum, but that was one of the destinations of this ship. So I was able to tell the Vassos brothers, who own the Thalassa Journeys and have been doing this now for decades, and very much part of the Greek shipping tradition, about these early experiences. That was what gave me my first love of the Aegean, and the lectures that accompanied it, which made all the difference. Even though it's by school teachers, the quality of classicists in schools was so high that they were like university lecturers.
Must have been an extraordinary experience at that
Yes.
age. Yeah, shaped your life.
Yes. Well, as Jefferson said, I go down on my knees and thank God that my father introduced me to the pleasures of the classics. And so although he didn't make it essential, as it was not an exclusive subject at the university, he thought that it was something that had brought him enormous pleasure in his life, as well as providing him with a lot of insights.
Looks like Mary Tybal has a question. You have to unmute
Yeah.
yourself.
I was just gonna ask, it sounds like each of the two trips are gonna propose a book. But if there are other books that the professors, which I say with great respect, suggest or like, I think just even sending out the list would be great.
Yes.
You don't have to send us all the books, but I like to read them all.
Yes. Well, I mean, there was one, the Penguin Book of the Greeks by Quito, Kitto. It sold 2 million copies in the 1960s. And some of it's very dated, especially the final chapter on the Greeks and women and how the Greeks thought about women. And remember, Quito was born in the 1890s. It reflects some of his views. But it's incredibly readable. And he was part of a generation who were really immersed in the classics and the language. And so even some of these early books I've got on my list because
That'd be great.
they still remain very good.
I was an early on woman in Virginia, and trust me, we're
Yes.
used to not having our perspective accepted, so we're good. Thanks.
Well, I suppose he was ahead of his time, and at least he addressed the subject. But it did make me laugh when he tried to make the case that the Greeks were not, that they were quite progressive on that subject, which I
We've
don't
been
think-
laughing for
Yes.
decades about some of this. So.
Yes.
Well, I happen to know that Andrew has somewhere to be, even though it's after 11, isn't it, in London now?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. We really
I'm
appreciate you
actually-
putting on a tie for us at this late hour.
I'm going from central London since out to Aylesbury, but I'll be back in central London tomorrow to see the musical Hamilton for the first time. I was meant to see it in 2020 with the same friend with whom I ran the trip to Oxford, Jeannie Grant Moore, who's at the University of San Diego. So I'll finally see Hamilton, having heard so much about it.
Oh yeah, that's a must for you,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yes, it is. Although we're not entirely happy with the treatment of Jefferson.
Yeah, right.
But that's where we are at the moment, that
Right.
we now glorify the Federalists rather than the Republicans.
Right.
It's called Hamilton for a reason.
Yes.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you for showing up. And if you have any questions, feel free to give me or Mary Lynn a call. We are around. And thank you for showing up. And David, again, thank you for your input, and Margaret and Carolyn.
Thank you, Kevin. And I hope everybody will join us.
Yeah, and there's Gretchen still in her office in New York.
And those of you who know me are not surprised.
Right. Good point. So, all right. Well, take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks again,
everyone.
Andrew.
Bye.